Okay, that was fun.
Well, good. You should have. You mentioned looking at some things with respect to skepticism, so that's probably fresh in your mind.
Or did he?
I guess no one's sure anymore. Alex isn't.
How was your day, Dr. Goff?
It was long and fairly busy, but I think productive. I spent a couple of hours on Google Books again, typing in obscure Latin phrases, looking for obscure books that I'm not sure if they really exist or not.
Who scans these things in, man? They need drones to do that.
I think they've got almost as much. It's amazing what you'll find. For example, I got this a couple weeks ago off Google Books and had it printed for like $15.
Wow.
But it has all of the conventional Franciscan authors and their bibliographies and their biographies from the 17th century. And I found this book. This is kind of fun. This is by Mateus Ferkius. He was a Croatian conventual Franciscan who wrote. It was a rare thing back in the day. He knew Hebrew, Greek, and he knew French and Italian. But it was a rare thing for him to know Hebrew and Greek in that day. And he wrote several treatises. He was the chair of philosophy and chair of theology in the convent of Padua, the University of Padua, for decades. And he and another famous conventual Franciscan, Bartholomew Mastrius, or Magistro he's called to, they had an ongoing war for about 30 years.
Wow.
It's pretty interesting. He wrote one of the rare gems that I had to do a lot of work to find on Google Books. It's not actually cataloged properly. He has an 800-page treatise on the angels according to St. Bonaventure. And that's just one volume. I can't find the second volume. I see it listed in all these old bibliographies, but I've never seen it cited, and I'm not convinced it actually exists. It's just, people were plagiarizing other people's bibliographies. But I'm trying to discern whether or not it exists. But I have that too. I had it printed out.
So, what do you use that lulu.com to print those out?
No, they have a get print copy of all these old out of copyright books, and so I've been working with Harvard Bookstore. I guess it must be by the university. It's a private bookshop. They have a print-on-demand service. So, this book right here I had printed off at the same time. It's about, 350, 360 pages. And I think it cost around $15.
Wow.
And so, what's really great about it is now with everything on Google Books, you have access to texts that people 100 miles away back when they were first printed, you have greater access to these texts than they did back then. And so, with the treatise on the angels, I think I'm one of 3 entities that possesses a copy of the book that I know of in the world.
What language is it?
The other 2 are libraries. So it's just amazing what Google Books has. And the great thing about Google Books as well is you have all these old scanned Latin text with their funky script, but they're actually OCR as well, so you can do word searches. So it's really, really incredible. But anyway, I think, is everyone ready?
Thanks.
I can hardly.
So is Jeremy Daggett not here?
He I don't know if he's going to continue.
Father Lewis will be in at about 6:30. A little after 6:30, Father Lewis should come in.
Okay. Well, that'll be good. He make sure to. Is he going to be in New York then?
Yeah, he's here in Griswold, New York. Griswold. He's here in Maine, New York.
Okay. New York. Oh. It's confusing to me. I couldn't name all the New England states. They're all jam-packed together, you know.
That's why I got the as well.
But well, let's go ahead and get started with the word of prayer. In the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Dear Heavenly Father, we come to you and thank you for your providence. We thank you that this nation is consecrated to the Immaculate Conception, and we ask that through her intercession, she would intercede for this country and bring about a spiritual awakening and renewal, and also that through her intercession today and the intercession of Saint Bonaventure and all the great Franciscan saints and doctors, that we would come to a greater understanding of what you have to teach us through Saint Bonaventure. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so last week, I think we ended with a promise to go into question 4 of the De Scientia, right?
Yes.
Okay. So to get us started in that direction, how far did we get in terms of analogy? We distinguished between analogy of proportion and the analogy of simple resemblance, as opposed to equivocation and univocities, right? Did we go over that? We did, right?
Yes, started to at least.
Okay. Well, to finish this up, we discussed analogy of proportion and analogy of proportionality, and we had a long discussion about health, food, bodies, and urine, right? Do we know exact? Are we clear on that? We're not cloudy at all?
I'm roughly there.
You're roughly there. Okay. Well, then the analogy of simple resemblance is a simple one-to-one correspondence, but yet Saint Bonaventure doesn't want to affirm that it's univocal, because remember, for Saint Bonaventure, univocity entails a common name or concept and nature. Following here?
Yep.
And so what he posits instead is analogy, but then he distinguishes, and this will be important in coming to understand how God has knowledge of creation through his ideas, and also how we can attain to the eternal reasons through contuition, which Bonaventure discusses in question 4. So Bonaventure then distinguishes with the unity of simple resemblance between the fact that God is a likeness of a creature insofar as he has an idea of a creature that serves as the reason or means, establishes the relationship between himself and his knowledge of a created being. And we have knowledge of God or knowledge of truth because we have abstracted concepts that are in a sense underwritten by these divine ideas. Well, how in the world do they connect? Well, he says they connect in this way through simple resemblance, a one-to-one resemblance. But yet he says this simple resemblance isn't univocal. He says it's analogical. So the next point is, and if you look on, let me see here, the analogy, one of the analogy papers I sent you, there's a distinction in any kind of concept of a thing or of a quiddity or of an essence between, when considering these things, there's a distinction between quality and quantity. And Bonaventure does affirm that there can be a common quality across or between two disjuncts of an analogical kind of relationship. So, for example, divine wisdom and human wisdom share a common quality. And he does affirm that. There's a common essence or ratio that identifies wisdom as something commonly said of both God and creation, or God and a rational creature who actually has wisdom. But then he distinguishes between quality and quantity. Now, quantity, again, this is this interesting notion that was really heavily developed in the first place by Alexander of Hales, Bonaventure's teacher, also St. Thomas's teacher, although St. Thomas went in different ways. This notion of quantity, which has to do with this understanding of degree, finite, infinite, partial, or maximal. Do we remember that discussion from last week? So when speaking of a spiritual quantity or power, we can speak of an infinite quantity. And what we're saying is that it's maximal, it's absolutely perfect, and it's logically, and therefore ontologically unsurpassable. And so this is, I think, where he notes this analogy in this one-to-one relationship of simple resemblance. Because he will affirm, on the one hand, there is a common quality, say, for example, again, to continue with our example of wisdom, between divine wisdom and created wisdom. But yet he says that there is a disproportionate or an unequal quantity, because obviously God is infinite and a created person is finite. And so the analogy then is with respect to the quantity or the degree of being, a particular instantiation of a perfection that is commonly predicated of a creature and of the creator. That's where the analogy is located, in the unequal quantity. And so what you have here then, and Bonaventure can affirm then, a simple resemblance between God and a creature in a certain respect, but he also is able to affirm analogies in terms of the vertical relationship between God and creature, because God is infinite and a creature is finite. But also, even with respect to the concept of divine wisdom or infinite wisdom and finite wisdom, he's also then able to posit a kind of proportion. So there's a proportion or a proportionality with respect to created wisdom and uncreated wisdom. And so what he's noting here is that there's a proportionality or a proportion between created wisdom and uncreated wisdom. And so you do have a simple one-to-one relationship where there's a common concept of wisdom. But even within the concept of divine wisdom, as we understand it in our mind, and created wisdom, as we understand it in our mind, there's a kind of proportionality that distinguishes the two, or that by which we're able to distinguish between uncreated wisdom and created wisdom. And I would suggest here that this proportionality is simply the fact that with God's wisdom, his wisdom is proportional or in relation to infinity, this maximal perfection. And created wisdom is in relation to finitude. And so what you have then is again a proportionality even in the concept of created wisdom and uncreated wisdom, or between the concepts of created wisdom and uncreated wisdom, that yet preserves the commonality or univocity, one might say, of the concept of wisdom as such, that allows us to speak or to recognize the one-to-one correspondence between God's wisdom or God's idea of wisdom and our idea of wisdom, and also uncreated wisdom and created wisdom. And so what you have then is you have both univocity and analogy functioning. But with Bonaventure, analogy is robustly rooted in the metaphysical order, and he's not so much concerned with the conceptual order. He simply concedes that there is a common concept between divine and created that identifies a quality, namely wisdom, the fact of having knowledge ordered perfectly by love, with respect to eternal truths, eternal truth itself. Yet, when you think of uninfinite wisdom or created wisdom, you also recognize that there's a proportionality between the two concepts, because infinite wisdom is infinite and created wisdom is finite. And so there's both univocity and analogy, univocity and proportion. And on the ontological level, this proportionality, or the assertion of analogy, is the primary consideration for St. Bonaventure, because he's strongly committed to maintaining and to making absolutely clear that God is more unlike a creature than a creature. And I think that's, I think if there are any questions, this is the time to raise, because now I think we're going to transition into a consideration of question 4.
So I've heard people say that Thomas embraces analogy of proportion, or others say that he embraces proportionality, where that proportion being like the healthy, you could say healthy food and healthy urine,
Right.
whereas proportionality would be like a healthy dog and a healthy squid. I mean, in the sense of like, there's two different things and they're both healthy, and we're still talking like or maybe you could say a healthy environment of a squid and a healthy environment of a dog, which are two very different environments. And so in the sense, there's a proportionality, correct?
Right. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Sure. As water is to the squid, deep water is to the squid, so is a warm doghouse to the dog, so to speak.
Sort of, yeah.
In terms of environment. Yeah, so it's a 2-to-2 comparison, and that's proportionality, properly defined. Whereas proportion would be a comparison on the basis of a primary analogate, like a healthy body, and these secondary references or analogies that are derivative, like food and urine. And I think, as far as I know, and I'm not an expert, it's been years since I've looked at Thomas on these questions. I mean, literally, probably a decade. I would suspect he affirms both, because both were the common conceptual apparatus of theologians at that time.
Okay.
What is less clear to me with respect to St. Bonaventure, but seems clear, especially as St. Thomas was received in the manualist tradition, especially through someone like Cajetan, who lived in the 16th century, is not just analogical predication with respect to signifying things, but analogical usage of terms, such that the terms themselves, the concepts themselves used, are also analogous. And Cajetan said that Thomas held, or he argued that Thomas held both to an analogy of being and an analogy of what should I say, analogy of language or terms or concepts. And the latter is more difficult to justify, and I'm not perfectly clear on whether or not St. Thomas actually affirmed that. Because if you have an analogical concept, well, then it's clearly not a simple concept, and it's very difficult to perform a syllogistic act of reasoning if you don't have a middle term.
Yeah.
If the concept is analogous, you're at least stuck with 4 things. And you lack a middle term. And so that's what Cardinal Cajetan, so the analogy of naming also became very important in the Thomistic system. But I would suspect that Thomas Aquinas, St. Thomas, affirmed both analogy of proportion and analogy of proportionality, and perhaps very likely, like St. Bonaventure, at times used them interchangeably.
Okay.
To serve various purposes. Let's see. Is there anything else? Oh, go ahead. Yes.
With respect to the underneath this page here, I guess you can't see where it says simple resemblance. Underneath it says created and uncreated idea. Is there any way that we can speak of or can we speak of concept in an effective way, where you have like I'm thinking in particular what St. Maximilian Kolbe said, the uncreated and created Immaculate Conception, where conception is understood not intellectually but effectively. Does that tie into this in any way?
I think in terms of the order of knowledge, it would be at work here. I'm not sure I understand about effectively, except in this context, it would be difficult. It would already presuppose an effective disjunction between created and uncreated with respect to the Immaculate Conception. When St. Maximilian speaks of the Holy Spirit and he speaks of Our Lady, I think the analogy or the use of univocal concepts with their transcendental disjuncts, finite, infinite, this language or this means of reasoning about these realities is already, if we're going to speak and understand them, it's already conceptual and logical. And so what this will do, what language and logic simply does, is it simply names or speaks about realities that are present beforehand. Reasoning is always, in a sense, after the fact. We reason from the basis of realities. And so when we name Immaculate Conception as create or uncreate, we're using a univocal concept, conception, Immaculate Conception, in order to designate some common quality between the Holy Spirit as a conception of the Father and the Son's love, and Mary as an immaculately conceived person, firstborn daughter of the Father, mother of the Son, spouse of the Holy Spirit. We're using a common concept, namely conception and immaculate, in order to designate that the Holy Spirit and Mary share this common concept, but the intrinsic modality in which the Holy Spirit subsists and in which the Blessed Mother subsists is infinitely distinct, because one is finite, the other is infinite. And so to that respect, yes, you can speak of a kind of effective aspect to this, but this effective aspect to this will be used or spoken of or articulated through these univocal concepts with their transcendental disjuncts.
Okay.
Does that?
Thank you.
One final observation before we move to question 4 is with respect to the distinction between the divine ideas. Now remember, Bonaventure says God knows an infinite number of things, possible, actually existing, future, and final. We've gone over that questions 1, question 2, question 3. Bonaventure then speaks of the one divine idea, but the one divine idea which expresses this infinite extension of divine ideas. And Bonaventure also very clearly says God knows everything or every possible thing under its unique or proper idea or ratio in its fullness. So thus he knows everything perfectly and distinctly, whether you're talking genus or genera or species or individuals or accidents. He knows each of them properly. But the question is then, how do we speak of the different ideas in relation to the one idea when thinking of divine simplicity, right? Because remember, divine simplicity holds that God doesn't have parts. But yet divine infinity proposes, in the perfection of knowledge, distinct knowledge from eternity, proposes that he knows these things distinctly. He knows an infinite number of things distinctly. Well, here's where I think Bonaventure makes use of an early form or proto-form of the formal distinction. And the formal distinction, remember, simply posits the formal distinction I'm speaking now between the ideas themselves. So the formal distinction affirms something prior to the mind's action. The mind doesn't cause these things to be distinct. No, they're known distinctly because they're knowable distinctly, right? But yet, in God's knowledge, each of these items are really identical to his simple essence, so that he can't have parts. So Bonaventure has to explain this, and he goes back and forth by speaking of many ideas in terms, and the multiplicity of ideas in terms of their connotations with respect to created things, on the one hand, but he also, on the other hand, affirms that these ideas are really identical or really one in the one divine idea, the one truth, because the one truth or the one divine idea is identical to the simple being of God. And so what gives you? He never really fleshes this out, but you do see hints and you see distinctions that he makes. And I think a very important distinction that he draws in both the De Scientia Christi, as well as it becomes clearer in the De Mysterio Trinitatis, is what he calls the differentia minima. And this differentia minima simply affirms that in terms of God's knowledge of each possible, actual, future, or final reality, he knows these things distinctly and properly. And so there must be some minimal difference between these ideas that don't compromise the unity of the divine essence, the unity of the divine truth. And so what he says on, what Bonaventure says on page 105 is that within the divinity, the likeness that God knows, the likeness of the created thing, the likeness that God knows is the expressive truth. We've talked about this. The truth is one, and it's a perfection of God's essence. However, in terms of the expressive, the single expressive truth, there are multiple terms, or there are multiple entities or items expressed. And this expression of these multiple items, everything that God knows, his infinite extensive knowledge, is radically one with the divine being, but yet connotes distinctions in reality, that in their reality, their proper reality, created reality, they're really distinct, many of them. So again, you're stuck with the dilemma. But then he goes on to say on page 106 that the expressive act of the divine truth, there are three elements that need to be distinguished. One is with respect to the truth. Another is with respect to the expression of the truth. And the third is with respect to the object of the truth. Now we're thinking about God ad intra here, and how this differentia minima, this proto-form of the formal distinction comes to play. Now let me go back and give you the four conditions for a formal distinction to obtain. And we'll see if Bonaventure's account in some way matches up with this with respect to the differentia minima. The first condition for the formal distinction is that the distinction derives from realities or items that are distinct in themselves prior to the operation of the mind. That means the mind doesn't create their distinction. The truth of their distinctness is prior, objective. Second, the formal being, or the objective distinction, or the distinct quiddity or nature or essence of what is known is not merely virtual. And by a virtual containment is something kind of like if you look at a line, it virtually contains an infinite number of line segments within that line. But prior to the mind operating to divide the line, there are no distinct segments. You see what I'm saying there? So that's a virtual containment, is a line and its parts or its segments. But if you just consider the line itself, it doesn't have parts or segments apart from you or a mind dividing the line up into segments. The line is a simple continuum. Okay? So the second condition for the formal distinction is that the quiddity or formal being of whatever item that is formally distinguished from another item must not be merely virtual. The third condition, related or flowing from the second condition, is that the items under consideration, the quiddities, natures, formalities, must be actually distinct from one another and not confused. So, for example, one could simply confuse the distinction between the genus of animal and the difference rational. You could become confused at the level of the genus animal and say that rational in a man is formally distinct from animal. But the distinction that we're talking about is it has to be actually distinct and not confused. It actually has to be an irreducible concept. So wisdom as opposed to knowledge, as opposed to will. You can't express wisdom when you express will. They are related, but the expression of the quiddity of wisdom is distinct from the expression of the quiddity of the will. They're distinct in themselves and by virtue of themselves. And so finally then, the fourth condition is that there must be a real identity in being or essence, in re or in essentiate. So the reality under consideration has to affirm their real identity. And this, with respect to God, is simply the real identity of all of his properties in his simplicity with his own being or essence. And to take a created example, the real identity in between the soul and its powers of memory, intellect, and will. In reality, the soul is just one, but it has these three formally distinct powers, or three formally irreducible modes of operation or activity, namely memory, intellect, and volition. And so these are the four conditions for the formal distinction that Bonaventure lists. Well, what we have Scotus lists. Well, what we have in St. Bonaventure is we have, with respect to the first note, it must be an act prior to the mind's operation, is that the essence of God, remember we're talking about the divine essence as truth, eternally expresses these ideas. So it's by virtue of the essence itself, as truth, that these ideas are eternally expressed. So in the sense, God knows these distinct ideas by virtue of him essentially expressing the truth. And the truth is not identical to knowledge, conceptually. And so, insofar as the essence, divine essence, eternally expresses every truth, an infinite number of truths, eternally and in their own proper reality, this would satisfy the first condition, because the essence is expressing the truth apart from a consideration, or the expression of the truth does not essentially depend upon the mind's operation with respect to any object of knowledge. With respect to the second condition, the formal being must not be merely virtual, it must be actually distinct. When Bonaventure speaks of the exemplary ideas or similitudes, he speaks of them, again, I just noted, that God knows all possible things, all real things, by virtue of their eternally being expressed as the ratio cognoscendi of the divine mind. So the exemplary ideas themselves are being eternally expressed by the truth of the divine essence as distinct ideas, yet not separate or separable. With respect to the third condition, these distinct items must be actually distinct and not confused. Bonaventure just simply says it's sufficient to note that this thing or this idea is not that idea. Namely, the idea of dog is not the idea of cat. The idea of a horse is not the idea of a man. Bonaventure just simply follows St. Augustine here. And so that's sufficient to note or point out that these ideas are not confused. They're actual. And then fourth, the real identity in being or essence of the whatever item under consideration as formally distinct from another item or set of items, is that Bonaventure clearly affirms by dint of simplicity and infinity the real unity and thus identity with the divine being itself. And Bonaventure articulates this in a more diffuse way, an indirect way, in his Disputed Questions on the Knowledge of Christ and in his Disputed Questions on the Mystery of the Trinity. But he establishes the basic facts, or he meets the conditions that Scotus establishes for affirming some sort of formal distinction that is neither real nor virtual. And this he calls in the Reveloquium and in the De Mysterio Trinitatis the differentia minima. And this is the minimum difference that one can find in the divine being. And I'll just read his definition of this from the Breviloquium because it's brief. So he's discussing in God the real distinction between persons, and then another form of distinction between the person and the essence, and then finally a third form of distinction. And this third form of distinction he calls the differentia minima, as opposed to the differentia realis or the differentia minor. And we'll leave the differentia minor aside, to the side for now, because really I think the minor and the minima collapse into the same kind of distinction. So St. Bonaventure writes in part 1, chapter 4 of the Breviloquium about this distinction. He says, this third distinction, the differentia minima, is the least, since it exists only in the connotations. And by that, Bonaventure's blocking any kind of affirmation of real distinction or real difference. Although one may be said of the other reciprocally, and the same thing may be said of both, nevertheless, the same thing is not connoted by both. That means this idea is not that idea. And by the same thing is not intended that both be understood. Then I'll skip down a bit. From this third distinction, the plurality of essential properties, namely the distinction between, say, God's simplicity or unity or infinity or eternity or necessity and any other essential property you can predicate of God, the plurality of essential properties and of the characteristics, whether temporal or eternal. So this refers to God's notions both with respect to his own perfections and the notes by which the various persons of the Godhead are distinguished, but also with respect to temporal things. And this would include any idea of a contingent or finite essence, either possible, actually existing, providentially willed as future, or eschatological. So, going on, whether temporal or eternal, whether proper or metaphorical, whether common or appropriated. Examples of what has been said are quite obvious. Having understood these things, it will be clear enough for us both to think and for both how to think and what to say about the sovereignty of the divine persons. Now, that's a very terse account, but what he's capturing here is that there is this kind of distinction that is equivalent to what Scotus will develop and call the formal distinction already present in St. Bonaventure, and this is the differentia minima. And it meets these four conditions that Bonaventure lays out that we just discussed. Yes, question.
Two questions. One, can you just very simply, there's someone who has a speaker close to their microphone.
I think it's probably us.
So if you could do something about that.
What's that? I didn't hear that. There's something about my voice or what?
No, that wasn't my question. I can hear my voice coming back through.
Like
An echo.
Oh, okay, okay.
So, yeah, someone has their speaker close to their microphone.
probably us.
I don't know who it is because I just have the internal speaker
Okay.
on my.
Anyways,
I'm not hearing any echo where I'm at.
Yeah.
okay,
it's working now, Dr.
it's working.
I
Somebody,
think it was us, maybe. I mean,
I don't know who it was, but anyways, could you give the reference in the breviloquium and the third condition of SCOTUS was that they must be actually distinct?
That means, yeah, what I mean by actually distinct is they must be in reality distinct. I'm not affirming an essential difference or a substantial difference. They just must be presently, not derivatively distinct. And this goes back to the first condition. They must be in act prior to the mind's operation, and in act as actually distinct. And actually doesn't connote a real distinction or a formal distinction here, because obviously really distinct things are actually distinct, and formally distinct things are actually distinct, but in terms of a different mode of distinction.
Okay.
Really distinct has to do with separability, or at least independent existence, and the formal distinction has nothing to do with separability. It just has to do with the fact that one concept is non-identical and irreducible to another concept, and the concept obviously derivative from the essence or quiddity, or the whatness. That's simply what quiddity means, the whatness of what is being considered.
And then could you give the reference in the breviloquium for the passage you read?
Yes, it's Breviloquium Part 1, Chapter 4. Part 1, Chapter 4, the last two paragraphs. What's important to note is...
On page 41 of this one.
Oh, you have that.
Sorry, Charles. 41 on that one.
What's important to note is that the language of the differentia minima that Bonaventure, I think, is actually operating as technical terms, the differentia realis, the differentia minor, and the differentia minima. I think those are technical terms in Bonaventure's philosophical language and categories, but it doesn't come out in the English translation by Monty. But if you have a look at the Latin original, you find these technical terms present. And then if you want to look at a parallel text that helps bring out these differences, you can look at Caritas and Primo. I don't know about that, but let's see here. Let's see. Oh yes, page. I would say page 229 and following, but especially page 233, and that will provide the references to, plus the Latin original of how Bonaventure uses these terms in question 3 of the De Mysterio Trinitatis. And so you can see how he develops that distinction and employs it. Both prior to the Breviloquium, but also flowing out of the De Scientia Christi. And then I see your hand, Alex. And then, if I remember correctly, although I haven't read it recently, is I think the language of the differentia minima also shows up in the De Scientia Christi. I think maybe question 2 in the original Latin. But it's my contention that that's a technical term, and Father Peter is in full agreement on that score with me. Dr. Plato.
So on it, I'm just wondering if you can say a little bit more about the definition here in the Breviloquium.
Yeah.
What is the idea of when he says, although one may be said of the other reciprocally?
That has to do with specifically in this discussion, he's talking about how to speak about God. And so this has to do with the way that we predicate of God, and there are several modes of predication that Bonaventure distinguishes. So we can say, reciprocally, we can say the divine essence and divine knowledge. We can say the divine essence is the divine knowledge, and the divine knowledge is the divine essence. And so there's a reciprocal relationship, understanding how you're using those terms, because you're having to modulate between speaking about essence or substance and then speaking about...
So you
Go ahead.
say, so one of the terms can be the subject and the other the predicate, and then vice versa.
That's right, depending on how you're using the term. So you can take, for example, divine knowledge as essential to God, and thus identical with God's essence. And you can say the divine knowledge is the divine essence, understanding divine knowledge to be an essential property, implying essential identity with the divine essence. And so they can be spoken of reciprocally in that sense, at least. But you have to understand that you're supposing the terms in a different mode with a different scope. And if you look at page, let's see, actually I'm not going to give you a page. If you look at chapter 4 of the Breviloquium, he speaks, because this is the particular context.
What page?
I'm looking at the Latin text now. Chapter 4 of the Breviloquium, I'll find the text here. Beginning on page 131. No, excuse me. Part 1, chapter 4. The Catholic expression of this belief, page 37 of the Breviloquium. And so Bonaventure outlines 5 different ways in which to express certain things with respect to God.
Okay.
And so you have to understand, when he speaks about reciprocity, he's speaking, building upon or flowing out of this way of distinguishing ways of speaking about God. And that's a rather complex thing. I'm almost finished with a book chapter on this where I try to explain this a little further. That will be published in the summer, but that's beside the point. And your second question was related to the first. What was that again, Alex? You said reciprocally, or?
Yeah, that's the first thing. I mean, everything in that definition, I just want more on and more examples. So just give as much or little as you want based on time, but I'm interested in definitions.
Yeah, I understand. Basically, my point in appealing to this passage was to show that the differentia minimum speaks to those things that God knows as distinct. And so how is minima functioning in this context? What kind of distinction? Because it can't be a real distinction, but it's not merely virtual. And so, based upon what Bonaventure says in question 3, especially of the De Scientia Christi, he provides or reaches the criteria that Scotus provides with respect to what are the conditions of the formal distinction obtaining. And so this formal distinction, or the differentia minima that Bonaventure speaks of, is the way that Bonaventure navigates, on the one hand, the simple and infinite unity of God, on the other hand, the real distinction in creation, but also his knowledge of an infinite number of ideas. And so he posits this minimal distinction that obtains between, God's knowledge of a cat is not God's knowledge of a dog, insofar as they terminate in different knowable items. But insofar as they're rooted or really identical to the divine essence, they are identical. But I'm not exactly sure in terms of the definition. We can go back and look at the definition. If I read the Latin text, it says the first difference is major, which is able to be found in the divinity, for it is in the supposits, and it is by this that one is not said of another. One thing is not said of another. So when he says that the major difference is in the deposits, we don't say Father of Son, because there's a real distinction between Father and Son. Okay? And this again is modes of predication, or modes of speaking about the divinity. But it is also, one is able to be said of it. One thing is now I'm hearing an echo. One thing is able to be said of another, as with respect to speaking of the person in relation to the essence. And so you can say the Father is God and the Son is God, but you can't say the Father is the Son. All right. And this is called the differentia minor. It's not a real distinction, but it notes the different ways in which the Father, Son, and Spirit possess the divine being. The Father as unoriginate and originating, the Son as generated and spirating, and the Spirit as being passively spirated. And so in this sense, they relate, or they possess the divine being according to different modes. And this is the minor difference. And this allows Bonaventure to distinguish how we can speak of the Father and the essence, and the Son and the essence, and the Spirit and the essence, according to the different modes that the Father, Son, and Spirit have or possess the divine being, yet in terms of the common possession of every perfection of the divine being. So this is the middle way of speaking of, or this is the middle way of, or the lesser difference underneath the major difference between supposits. And then finally, he says there's a third, therefore, difference, which is the minima, because this is in connotation, or the connoted things. And connoted, or connotation in Latin, is from the word connotere, which just means to know with something else, to be known with. So, by virtue of the fact that God knows or has the ratio cognoscendi of dogness, he knows dog and he knows dogs. And so dog and dogs, real dogs, are known with the divine idea.
Like known by.
They're called the rats.
Something happened.
A kind of oblative, or a statement of means. And so they're known by the divine reasons. They're co-known with or through the divine reasons.
So connotation, the Latin word means means known, like known be.
Pardon me?
Known by way of, or known.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. And so on the one hand then, because things distinct are known by these ideas, there has to be already a distinction in terms of the expression of the ideas themselves. And so the expression of the ideas is distinct insofar as their ratio cognoscendi for what God knows of things that are not God. But yet they're not distinct in the mode of being that these entities exist in themselves. And so Bonaventure again has to answer, well, how can God know things that are distinct if they're not distinct? And so this is why he posits this differentia minima. Yes, they're not distinct in terms of essence or reality, and they are really distinct in terms of the realities that are known by reason of the ratio cognoscendis, but they're only minimally different in terms of the ratio cognoscendi themselves, or the rationes cognoscendi themselves. And so this is exactly what Bonaventure is talking about. Scotus is talking about with respect to the formal distinction. Is that the essence, as truth, is always expressing these things, eternally expressing these things. And by dint of the real identity of the expression and the things expressed with the divine essence, you're not involving, you're not compromising simplicity, but you're also affirming that God knows these things and expresses these things eternally. God is not dependent upon creation, or actually knowing that this cat exists or that cat exists in order to have the idea of this or that cat. That's what Bonaventure is trying to affirm there. And then, insofar as their exemplary ideas, their formal being is not just virtual. So, for example, here's an example. The genus of animal can be said to virtually contain a dog and a man. But the genus of animal itself doesn't imply a dog or a man, right?
Right.
But it virtually contains the ideas of dog and man insofar as dog and man are known under the aspect of the genus of animal. Okay? But since these exemplary ideas are expressing eternally every truth, God already has the proper ideas of this dog and this man, and by virtue of which he has the exemplary idea of dogness and madness, and the idea of the genus of animal. Basically, it's an affirmation by Bonaventure that God knows everything in their proper, fullest realities. The third is Bonaventure's affirmation that the idea of a dog and a man, following Augustine, I think it's a horse and a man. The idea of a horse is not equal or identical to the idea of a man. And so this satisfies condition 3. They're actually distinct. They're not confused. And then the final condition is the obvious one that Bonaventure is trying to preserve. And in a sense, he begins there with the essence expressing this truth, and he ends there with the fact that even these ideas, there's a real identity of these ideas, or these rationes cognoscendi, with the essence itself, the divine being itself. Thus, you're not compromising simplicity. And this differentia minima is what Bonaventure uses to speak of those conditions being satisfied. Any questions, observations at this point? Okay. Well, now let's move on to question 4. I think we can celebrate. But you know what? I'm not really telling the truth. We're not going to go directly to question 4. We're going to go back a little bit. This probably will be reviewed to some of you, but hopefully it's useful. We've got to talk first, before we start talking about human knowledge or divine illumination, we've got to talk about, well, what does Bonaventure think about human knowledge as such? What are the mechanics of knowledge? And so we've got to talk about the senses, the interior and exterior senses. We've got to talk about abstraction, the active and passive intellects, the sensible species, the intelligible species, the phantasms, and all that good stuff that everybody talked about back in the day. Now, how many of you... What's that?
Bill's very excited right now because this is the stuff that he's been learning this semester.
Oh, well...
So he would have...
Good.
4 months ago, he would have no idea what anything in that sentence meant, and now he's like, I know what you're talking about.
That's my stuff. This is my
second time. That's how I feel every time I talk about this stuff. It's like I know I've heard of this before, but I have no idea what I'm talking about. Okay, first of all, then the mechanism of knowledge for Bonaventure, as for everybody who is Aristotelian, and I think in this sense, as common sense, Bonaventure, knowledge begins in the senses, and we know what the senses are. They're what? There are 5. Do we know those?
Yeah. Seeing and touching and tasting and smelling.
Seeing, touching, and hearing.
And hearing.
That's right. When I was reading Matteo Ferchius today, I was reading his Vestigationes Peripateticum, and he was talking about actually the order in which the senses arise, and he argues that touch is the first sense. And he gives some interesting arguments about infants in utero. I don't know how he remembers such things, but he explained how, you obviously couldn't see or taste or smell. You probably could see light and dark, but you wouldn't taste or smell while you're in utero. And hearing, it would be different or muffled. So he actually gives the order, I believe, is touch, then sound, then light, then tasting, then smelling. And some of those things come after birth. So, the 5 exterior senses. And then Bonaventure distinguishes these 5 exterior senses from the 4 interior senses. And this was fairly common. Scotus, I think actually, if I'm remembering right, and we'll review this, I think he reduced essentially the interior senses, the 4 interior senses, to just the 1 common sense. And he doesn't have many more interior senses than the 1 common sense. But going back, so you have this distinction of exterior and interior senses. Generally, all the senses, these 9 senses, are physical or corporeal. They're stuff that happens to and happens in physical material being. as distinguished from spiritual entities. And so, Bonaventure explains that knowledge begins in the exterior senses. And I'll just read some passages by him really quick. He says, the human intellect, when it is created, is as a blank slate, and in a state of potency to every possibility, obviously every possible thing that can be known. He goes on, he says, man is said to be a little world, a minor mundus, has 5 senses as a kind of 5 gates through which everything in the sensible world enters the soul. He's using these metaphors. Another passage, he says, it should be noted that this world, which is called the macrocosm, and that's the external outside world, enters our soul, which is said to be a microcosm, through the gates of the 5 senses. It is by means of these sensible items we apprehend, we enjoy, and we judge. So he's stating very clearly that it's by means of the senses we come to apprehend some sort of concept of a thing, that we delight in the knowledge of truth, and that we judge about matters or items of truth and falsehood.
Sorry, Jared. I mean, Dr.
Yeah.
Dow. Where is this you're reading from? I missed the reference.
I wasn't giving them.
Chapter 2 of the Itinerarium.
Oh, okay.
I was going to send these notes at some point, probably after the class. Let's see here. You won't get this one, Brother Charles. From these, it is clear there is a clear response to that question by which is asked whether every cognition is from sense. It must be said that it is not. For one must necessarily posit that the soul knows God and its very self, and those which are in its very self, namely the ideas, internal states of volition, that sort of thing, without the support of the exterior senses. Wherefore, if the philosopher sometimes says that nothing is in the intellect that was not first in the sense, and that every cognition has its rise from a sense, this must be understood of those which have their being in the soul through an abstracted similitude. Similitude here is likeness, or species, or concept. Bonaventure uses the word similitude in many senses in his philosophy and theology, and here it's functioning as an idea, or a species, an intelligible species. And these are said to be in the soul after a manner of speaking or writing. That's from the second book of the Sentences, distinction 39. But what these statements point out is that Bonaventure, unlike some people take him to be, affirms with Aristotle that the soul is a kind of blank slate, a tabula rasa, and that knowledge at least begins in the senses, even if not all knowledge derives directly from the senses. Going further, he will state that knowledge is occasioned by the senses, even if the senses themselves, as material, cannot provide the formal content of everything known. So in that sense, he's very much like Aristotle, but in another sense, as we'll come to find out, these senses and the process of abstraction, in and of themselves for Bonaventure, do not explain spiritual knowledge. He says they're essential and they're requisite and integral to knowledge, but in and of themselves they can't explain knowledge. Now, he's not a skeptic. In fact, thinking about some questions that Friar Charles asked last week about skepticism is, and here's a little parenthetical tangent, I would say Bonaventure's response to skepticism would be one which could be broadly construed, maybe Alex or Dr. Plato could speak to this, something more along the line of common sense. It's just commonsensical not to be skeptical about certain things, even though you can, in fact, be wrong in particular cases. So it's common sense to affirm the reliability of knowledge in the senses. Secondly, if the intellect does make mistakes, it is through a precipitous or ill-formed or ill-based judgment about the senses and their operation and their object as such. So, you might think, for example, sitting in a crowded bar room or sitting in a loud concert, not that any of us would go to such a thing, a rock concert or something, you might be able to think you could hear the conversation of somebody 5 seats over, right? Because you're hearing words, you're hearing sounds come out of their mouth, and you're thinking, hey, I'm hearing what's going on, and then you repeat the conversation. And of course, you probably have garbled it and misrepresented it badly, not because your hearing or your sense of hearing is wrong, but simply because the conditions in which or under which your hearing organ was exercised exceeded its powers. It wasn't in its proper range of operation. And so you attributed verity to what you experienced sensorily in the wrong mode. You drew the wrong conclusions about your sensory experience. The right conclusion or right judgment would be, well, I can't make this conversation out clearly because there's so much background noise. You see? And so that's the kind of standard or typical reply of Aristotelian type thinkers, is that really there's the intellect, the object of the intellect is truth. And there is a kind of connatural orientation and teleology of the intellect with respect to truth that is reliable. And when we make mistakes, or we make erroneous judgments, it's not because the intellect is defective. It's really not even necessarily because the senses are defective. And, another parenthetical, establishing what is the normity and normative function of the sentences, I think that for Bonaventure would be trial and error a posteriori. It would be inductive. It wouldn't be a priori. You discover how the senses should work and their normal conditions or proper operating conditions by successfully making judgments and successfully using them. I don't think he has a preconceived notion or a system to say these are the absolute conditions under which the senses must operate, or I can establish the absolute parameters beforehand, the proper operating condition for the senses. And so end of parenthetical. And so, Bonaventure wouldn't ascribe error to intellect. He wouldn't ascribe error to senses. Well, in the first place, because the senses are material, and they're not rational per se. So they don't make judgments. They don't make errors. They just function properly or function improperly. Go ahead. Yes, question.
Hey, yeah, that's what I was thinking, because when he said the 5 senses, he said they apprehend, joy, and judge.
No, they're the means by which.
Oh, means by which. Okay.
That's right. Let me go back and read that. It is by means of these sensible items, or known through the senses, that we apprehend, enjoy, and judge.
Thank you.
The senses themselves don't judge. So, with respect to the skeptical problem, I don't think Bonaventure's too motivated by that. I think he presupposes the fact that we do have reliable and certain knowledge, and he's seeking to explain how that happens or the reason why that is possible. He's not addressing directly the skeptical problem. He's fairly common sense on that point, fairly Aristotelian. So he never had a Cartesian moment. But, as we will see later, it's his account of divine illumination that doesn't answer directly the critique of knowledge, but it answers or responds to, in a sense, preemptively, to what would motivate the critique of knowledge. So it answers a question on a different plane, and it doesn't resolve all the problems that skeptics will bring up. But I think it does address the limitations of abstraction, and how abstraction itself cannot be appealed to for a total or complete explanation of why there is knowledge or how knowledge is possible. Okay, going on then. So you have the 5 external senses or exterior senses. And what happens with these 5 exterior senses is that you have a sensible object which, for lack of a better term, emits rays through the sensible substances accidents. These accidents emit rays of sensible species. It emits qualities that can be picked up or resonate with the external senses. And so these qualities hit the senses, and the senses recognizes them. The senses are able to, in a sense, decipher the information on a physical level of what the accidents of a sensible substance are emitting. And so what you have then, you have the substance emitting qualities through its accidents. You have the medium, which are the sensible species themselves, and then you have the organ of the senses, which the organs of the senses, which are the terms of the sensible species. So in some sense, you have to think of the sensible species that are emitted, so to speak, by the accidents of a given material substance. You have to understand the sensible species as establishing a relation between the senses and the sensed object. Does that make sense?
It makes sense.
I'm full of a posteriori puns. Let's see. Okay, so then you have this basic mechanism. You have object, sensible object known, you have sensible species, and you have the external senses. Well, the problem you have here is you have 5 external senses. And seeing is not hearing, smelling is not tasting. Well, actually, smelling and tasting are more closely related than most people want to admit. But then you have touching. I can't always tell the difference between smelling and tasting. Well, no, I guess I can tell the difference between tasting and smelling, but not smelling and tasting. But anyway, so you have these disparate senses, and they're physical. They're distinct. Your eyes are not your nose, and your tongue isn't your ears, and your other these 4 senses aren't anything with respect to your skin, your sense of touch. So the problem is then, okay, you have this disparate data hitting all these senses, or at least some of these senses. Well, how do they become organized? Well, this is where Bonaventure speaks of the external senses, or the external senses being the organ that receives the sensible species from the material substance. Well, then the external organs somehow supply the internal senses with the same information, and the internal senses operate on this disparate sensory information to come up with a unified bundle. Right? Something unified, a unified kind of material experience. And the most basic interior sense that Bonaventure speaks of, and this he discusses in the first book of the Sentences, is called the common sense. And this is common to St. Thomas as well. The common sense basically detects qualities. Common qualities between things. It's called common because it functions to unite or unify the disparate sensory information that are supplied by the external organs, the external sense organs. And then from this common sense that kind of bundles all this disparate information into a unity of common qualities, then you have what Bonaventure calls the imagination, or the imaginative internal sense, and this is what produces what's called the phantasm. And the phantasm is important in medieval and Aristotelian philosophical psychology, because it's the phantasm that is the object upon which the agent intellect, and we'll get to that, acts in order to come up with an abstract concept via what's called the intelligible species. So the imagination then produces the phantasm on the basis or flowing out of the operation of the common sense. And then he also lists a third interior sense, which is comparison and division. Now, what I'm expecting here is the comparative and dividing power simply allows one to distinguish between phantasms of different kinds of things. You know, my phantasm of a dog is different than my phantasm of a cat. My phantasm of a cat's whiskers is different from my phantasm of a cat's eyes. And so through all of this disparate sensory material and the phantasm that we possess, we also can distinguish between different aspects or avenues of what's being known in terms of the interior senses, the internal senses. Was that Father Angelo just walking by?
That was.
It was.
Did he kick a cat or something?
Sorry, Jared.
How are you?
I'm all right. I'm fine.
What did you do? It looks like you met a stone that was too big for your
No,
toe.
I have an old injury that I'm just trying to nurse a little bit.
I see. Okay.
I should be
What
I'm
was-
fine. I take the GRE on Monday, so say a prayer for me.
I will. I will.
That's
You
why I
feel-
haven't been attending. Next week I'll be here.
Oh, great. Well, that'll be fun. That
All
will be
right.
fun. I'll have you give a presentation on the fourfold wisdom right away. Because we used that earlier. That was really good, really helpful.
Okay, good. Happy to.
All right.
All right.
Well, it was great to see you.
Nice seeing you too.
And flowing from the common sense through the imagination and the phantasm into this power of comparison and division, we come up with sense memory. And memory is just the power to retain all of this stuff that we have from the external senses in both a unified and organized and distinct way, depending upon what we're talking about. And then I'll add a fifth internal sense that Bonaventure doesn't discuss much, and this is what he calls the estimative power. And the function of this power is simply by means of the senses to recognize on an animal level, on a physical level, what is dangerous or what is safe or attractive, what is repellent, what is attractive. And again, this is quite common to Thomas, these aspects. And I think, even though it's hard to prove that these realities, these internal senses really exist, or it's hard to demonstrate that Bonaventure has perfectly, exhaustively, and with perfect discrimination divided up these different powers, they do function as explanations and concepts to explain what the mind, or what the mind, the senses, the physical aspect of knowledge, what actually happens, or what must happen in order for us to arrive at the process of abstraction. Alex.
What was the third one about that you named?
The third one was simply the power
I
of
only have three.
comparison and division.
Common sense, imagination, comparison, division.
Well, I have this chart from Robert Hasnow's.
Yeah. Okay. What is that? What's on that?
He's
I
got.
can't see it.
You can't read that.
No,
Too small.
it is. Got it.
Anyways, he's got. This is for Aquinas, but so it's exactly what you just named, except Aquinas doesn't have this comparison division one.
Interesting, and that would probably be subsumed for Aquinas, I would guess, into the common sense.
Okay.
And so then you have these 4 and maybe 5 internal senses. What you have to remember here is when we're talking about these things, we're on the level of corporeality. This is what happens in the body and in the brain. This isn't, and obviously the soul is informing the body to function this way, but these operations are not properly spiritual. This is according to Aristotelian biology, and I think pretty good common sense reasoning about these matters. This is physical. I mean, this explains why St. Thomas can say in his treatise on the soul, he can say, I just have no idea how to explain how a soul separated from its body, could know anything, because it's in the body that the phantasm and memory lay, physical memory lay. And so if the soul doesn't have this, it has nothing to operate upon to arrive at knowledge. And so the importance of the common sense, the imagination with respect to the phantasm, comparison, and division and memory is they provide the continual physical stuff or physical information. And of course, that's kind of an oxymoron. I guess the informed physical stuff upon which the soul operates or the intellect operates to arrive at abstract spiritual knowledge.
So then, does Bonaventure pretty much follow the same line with the separated soul and its ability to know?
No, he wouldn't. No.
Okay.
Because, and this is not something I'm actually prepared directly to explain at this very moment, but he has a means by which to explain how the intellect could both operate, undergo change, and also know, because he views not just the body and soul as a single composite. He views the body as a substance or a partial substance, and the soul as a substance or at least a partial substance. And being a substance for Bonaventure is being composed of both form and matter. So the one soul is the form of the body. That's why the body suddenly begins to die after the soul leaves. But the soul itself is composed of what Bonaventure speaks of as spiritual matter and form itself, which is spiritual. So the spiritual matter is what allows perhaps for memory to abide in a state where the soul is separate from the body, but also it allows the soul to acquire new knowledge, acquire new information from some source, and undergo change. So because Bonaventure holds this hylomorphism, this matter form composition, both for the soul and body, but for the soul in and of itself, he's able to give a different account of what would be the conditions of knowledge for a separated substance like a soul separated from a body.
And you know that, does the common sense, was that first picked out by Aristotle in his book on the soul, or do you know where that comes from?
I don't know. I'm not sure where that comes from, but it definitely is. If it doesn't originate with Aristotle, it certainly was kind of enshrined in his philosophical anthropology.
All right.
So then, I'm just going to read some more quotes then. With respect now to the relation between the external and the internal senses. So what we have is we've arrived at memory and a phantasm. That's the important thing. We've begun with an object, a sensible object, and we've arrived at memory and a phantasm in the internal senses. Now, the intellect, the agent intellect, has something to operate on. Now I'll just read, again from the Itinerarium, chapter 2. These external sensible items are the first to enter the soul through the doors of the five senses. They enter not in their substantial reality. That means, the soul doesn't literally become a cat. But by means of the likeness or similitude, which are generated in the medium. Now, the similitudes generated in the medium here is the sensible species. Okay? And from the medium, that is from the sensible species, which establishes the relation between the sensible object and the external senses, and from the medium, these sensible items pass into the organ, namely the sense organ. In the first place, the external sense organ, or organs. And from the external organ, they move into the internal organ, and from the internal organ, they move to the apprehensive power. Now, the apprehensive power is, for Bonaventure, the first act of the mind, like Aristotle. Aristotle divides the mind up, the mind's actions into three acts: apprehension, composition, and division, and discursive reasoning. Well, apprehension is just simply the arrival of the mind at an abstract concept. And so it's from the internal senses, or through the internal senses, that the mind moves into the apprehensive power. Are you doing okay, Alex?
I'm all right.
Here, I have some coffee.
So do I, but I don't want to drink it. I want to go to bed afterwards.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so then, again, what Bonaventure is doing here very briefly is discussing, the order or the mechanism of knowledge moving from the outside to the inside into spiritual reality, spiritual knowledge. Another quote from the second book of the sentence commentaries, Bonaventure says, knowledge or science is by means of the senses. And that going on in a different location, experience is the principle of knowledge. What the importance here is that Bonaventure is not what would you say, innatist, like Descartes. Some people accuse Descartes of him. He says, no, knowledge begins with experience, and experience begins with, or at least is occasioned by, the senses, and thus by physical, material substances, or accidents, substances acting through accidents. And then finally, the last quote I'll read here it is undoubtedly true, according to the saying of Aristotle, that cognition is generated in us via the sense, memory, and experience, which in us is gathered into the universal idea. So again, you see these external sensory data being gathered through the common sense, arriving at through the imagination at a phantasm, and then being preserved in memory. Through all of these aspects, we arrive at a universal idea. And then this universal idea, Bonaventure calls the principle of art and science. Obviously, know-how and knowledge in itself. And now we've kind of moved from the outside to the inside. We need to talk about abstraction, the agent intellect and the passive intellect. Now, abstraction is just simply the notion of the soul's activity upon the phantasm to draw away from or consider in independence from the physical aspects of what is being considered, to draw out, to abstract. And so what you're doing in abstraction is just drawing out the universal spiritual principles. You might call it you're drawing out the encoding or the spiritual blueprint of the particular item of knowledge. And you're drawing this out of the phantasm. This is because again, the phantasm is kind of like that unified bundle that the external senses provided the internal senses. Obviously, the external sense is deriving its own knowledge from the external sensible object. And so then in this instance, then we're talking about the soul, but we're talking about the soul specifically as intellect, the power of intellection, the power of understanding, the power of arriving at knowledge of truth. And so then Bonaventure, again following Aristotle and the common account at the time, distinguishes not two powers or two substances or two distinct things in the soul, but rather two operations of the soul, as the agent intellect or the active intellect and the passive intellect. And this is important because Bonaventure is trying to avoid, and with Aristotle, he's trying to avoid dividing the soul up or the intellect up into different parts or into different realities. No, the agent and passive intellect are just simply two modes of the intellect's operation through which, or rather even, there are two ways of describing the means and order that the intellect must follow in order to arrive at knowledge of the truth, abstract concepts. And so Bonaventure here is not doing anything special. He's not dividing the intellect up into parts. And so if abstraction is the goal, because abstraction is the means by which we arrive at universal concepts, well, how does that happen? Well, in Bonaventure's account, it's simply that what's called the agent intellect, which Bonaventure, like St. Thomas, and unlike philosophers like Averroes, who denied the unique agent intellect, and Aristotle himself, who denied the unique agent intellect of every individual soul, Bonaventure and Aquinas, and another thing to note is someone like the famous theologian and bishop of Paris, William of Auvergne, also denied the agent intellect. He just said the agent intellect doesn't exist. The agent intellect is God. And so what Aquinas and Bonaventure are affirming here is that no, the agent intellect exists as a substantial, unique, or exists in reality in each rational substance. So each rational substance has its own agent intellect. It's not an abstract or universal function by which or upon which the knowledge is derived. So there isn't one universal agent intellect that we all participate in. No, each of us has his or her own agent intellect. And that's important because it demonstrates the uniqueness, or at least it's part and parcel to the uniqueness and individuality of every given soul. Because with Aristotle, who affirmed the unicity of the agent intellect, once the body died, there was no soul that was distinct that was left over. Rather, the soul just was, in a sense, not reassumed, but rather the universal agent intellect stopped functioning or informing this particular bit of matter. And so it had a lot to do with the university, the unicity of the agent intellect was part and parcel to the denial of the immortality of the soul. Well, Bonaventure and Bonaventure and Aquinas both affirmed the uniqueness and particularity of the agent intellect. Okay, so the agent intellect then, for Bonaventure, is simply that power of the intellect, or that mode of the intellect's activity that turns towards the phantasm, right, which is physical, turns towards the phantasm and draws out these universal immaterial encoding in this phantasm. So it draws out the code for catness, right? And this is what's called the process of abstraction, because it's drawing out this cat code. And the cat code itself, that is abstracted from the phantasm of the cat, which again is physical and corporeal, this is what is called the intelligible species. So if you have, with respect to the outer senses, the relationship between the external senses and the knowable physical substance, the relationship being the sensible species, well, there's going to be a parallel in the process of abstraction and the intellect's proper activity of abstracting. And this is the intelligible species, the coding that is present in the phantasm, but that has to be abstracted or drawn out and separated or distinguished in terms of its spiritual, informative, or essential notes. And so then what the agent intellect does is it draws out what's called the intelligible species and then impresses these intelligible species on the passive intellect. And insofar as it's impressing these intelligible species on the passive intellect, this passive intellect is being informed, so to speak, by a concept. And the termination of this process is the idea itself, what can be called then the expressed species. That's the idea that you arrive at. I have an idea of a cat, or rather, I have the idea of catness. And then I use my sensory experience and my phantasm of all the different accidental qualities of cats, along with memory, to distinguish this cat from that cat, that sort of thing. So what you have then again is the agent intellect operates on the phantasm to establish what are called the intelligible species, what I call the encoding in the agent intellect. But this intelligible species needs to be considered in terms of a relation that's established between the phantasm and the passive intellect, not as what is known in itself. You see what I'm saying? So it's not as though the intellect comes to know the intelligible species, and that's what it knows. No, it knows through the intelligible species. So what you have then is a set of relations. You have a relation between the passive intellect knowing and the phantasm, and then the phantasm through the external senses and the sensible species to the object known. Now, it isn't always this way because we have the power of sense memory, but sense memory supplies this link between the intellect and the external knowable substance in the absence of a substance. But it's important here to see that Aristotle and Bonaventure and Aquinas all agree in saying that the sensible species establishes a relation between the intellect as knowing an idea and the thing known. And this will avoid, kind of the idealism of someone like John Locke, who says we know ideas. No, Bonaventure will say, no, we know through ideas. Okay, does that make sense? A couple of things to note, though, here with respect to Bonaventure's account of the passive intellect and really the soul's relationship to the body and to sensible objects. Following generally the Augustinian kind of prioritization of spiritual realities and activities over physical realities, along with Aristotle's dictum or axiom, really of common sense, that an effect cannot exceed its cause, Bonaventure will argue that even in sensory knowledge, even in the occasion of gaining knowledge from external sensory information, the soul acts more upon what is known than what is known acts upon the soul. Because Bonaventure wants to affirm, both in terms of the fact that abstract knowledge is spiritual, and because the soul is superior in being to physical realities, that there's a certain priority, even if not chronological, to the soul and its physical objects of knowledge. Okay? And I'll read some passages from Bonaventure that make this point. The second thing, and this is where he departs from Aquinas and sorry, I just had my phone buzzing. Aquinas and Aristotle, is that he says the passive intellect, though passive with respect to the agent intellect's activity of impressing the intelligible species upon the passive intellect, the passive intellect isn't purely passive. It's also active, because again, it's a spiritual power, and the passive intellect turns itself towards its object of knowledge, and it's not merely acted upon. And what Bonaventure here is, following Augustine again, is he's affirming the priority of spiritual being and rational being, or rationality, and thus the priority of the spiritual over the physical. And so what we have then is we have, the agent intellect, the intelligible species, the impression of the intelligible species on the passive intellect, and then we have the species impressed, and that's the giving or impressing or the activity of the agent intellect upon the passive intellect. But when the passive intellect forms a concept, or the true term of knowledge or understanding is achieved, that's called the expressed species. And Bonaventure compares this bringing forth of the expressed species to like the bringing forth of a child. We speak a word in order to understand, and that word or concept is the term of this whole process of giving birth, beginning with the external sensible substance, but terminating in this spiritual word or abstract concept. And so this is the expressed species. Going on, I'll read some passages now from Bonaventure. Is that clear so far? What we've basically reviewed is the groundwork for Bonaventure's entire cognitive theory. And then how does illumination fit into this? Well, what you can see is we have physicality and mutability right now as the matter or the grist for arriving at immutability and a kind of necessity and eternality. And so how do these mutable and material realities produce this immutable and spiritual concept? Okay, this is the question, because everybody, including Bonaventure, Aquinas, and Aristotle, affirms that the operation of the intellect in arriving at an abstract universal concept, precisely because it's universal and immutable, is not physical. Okay? So how do you do that? How does the soul arrive at something that's unchangeable when the soul itself is changeable? And how does the soul arrive at something that's spiritual when its object of knowledge, its whole foundation or starting point for knowledge, is physical? So again, it's the question of the effect exceeding the cause that Bonaventure is really trying to address. Bonaventure just simply grants, though, that abstraction is true and valid, and that knowledge is spiritual. Knowledge of truth is spiritual. Okay, does that make sense so far?
Yeah.
All right, we'll just read quickly some aspects of Bonaventure's, some texts of Bonaventure himself where he discusses this. This comes from the second book of the Sentences, distinction 23. Bonaventure writes, the exterior object, and this is getting to what I mentioned earlier about the soul's priority over the physical objects of his knowledge. The exterior object does not act upon the soul, neither does it perfect the soul. Rather, the soul itself moves itself on the occasion of receiving the exterior object, and in informing itself, acts more upon the object than the object upon it. Okay? And I'll send these notes out to you. Another quote from the fourth book of the Sentences. The soul more produces a species or a similitude or a likeness in itself than from the body, then that from the body makes something in the soul. The point is basically, that's kind of a garbled translation, but the point is the soul operates more or is in more operation to produce a species than the body is in operation producing a species in the soul. What he's affirming here is the priority of the soul. Another lengthy quote from the second book of the Sentences, again, distinction 24. That to which is objected concerning the imagination, remember the imagination is one of the internal senses, that it is an active and passive power and does not differ, it can be said that it differs more than in the intellect, this active and passive power in the imagination. Because the corporeal organ in which phantasms are received is in the place of its passive power. But the imaginary force itself, or the imaginative force producing the phantasm, itself is in place of its active power. And so he's saying there's a greater distinctness in the external senses and the internal senses than there is in the active and passive intellects. Going on, Bonaventure clarifies, it can be said in another manner that it is not similar to the active and passive intellect, because when the species is brought down from sense all the way to imagination, the species does not go forth or does not issue forth from the genus of abstraction, which existed indeed in the sensing of the particular. But when the species arrives at the intellect, there is required a new genus or a new kind of abstraction and another genus of light. And this is interesting because Bonaventure here, like St. Thomas, is affirming that the agent intellect is a kind of light. This is where St. Thomas limits divine illumination, is the activity of the agent intellect to abstract universal truths from the phantasm. So Bonaventure here says the agent intellect is a kind of light. But he says this kind of light is not sufficient yet, later on. So going on then, to finish this quote, for that reason the intellect itself needs an active power distinct from the passive, more than the imagination or sense.
Abstraction. That drives the universal truth. Yeah.
Let's see, there's a couple more quotes. I'll just read another quote that emphasizes this notion of the agent intellect and its function as light. He said, Bonaventure writes, and this is in the second book of the Sentences, he writes, our agent intellect is a light when it converts itself over phantasm. It abstracts and purifies them, and in this manner illumines them. So up to this point, we're in quite a large degree of agreement with St. Thomas on this. Because this is where St. Thomas, I think, what is it, question 84 or 85 of the Prima Pars of the Summa, where he discusses, it might be question 78, or it might be none of those. Which one is it? Do you have that in front of you? Where he discussed?
77.
77, okay. This is where St. Thomas limits his discussion of illumination. And then one final quote. And this is uniting. This is actually disavowing any notion that the agent intellect and the passive intellects are distinct realities in the soul. And this is from the second book of the Sentences, again, distinction 24. Bonaventure writes, when we think of the agent and possible intellect, we ought not think of it as two substances, or as if of two powers so separated that one has to perfect its own operation without the other. So he's saying, no, they're not independent from one another. They're mutually implied, mutually conditioning of one another, and neither are they two substances. Moreover, we shouldn't think that the agent intellect understands something without the possible intellect, and that the agent intellect cognizes something, which, however, the man to whom that intellect belongs is ignorant. For these are vain and frivolous words, that my intellect understands something which I do not know. But those two differences are to be thought of thus, that they come inseparably unto the one complete operation of understanding, just as the light and a diaphanous thing come together for the abstraction of color. Then he's going against some philosophers. Nor are the words of the philosophers to be commonly followed here, because for the most part, they were deceived in regard to the influence of the intelligence over the soul, which intelligence the Catholic faith does not admit. This is referring, I'm quite sure, to the agent intellect, being this kind of abstract universal intelligence that operates to inform every particular rational body, we might say, particularly in the passive intellect. And so Bonaventure is saying, no, every person has an active and passive intellect. They both must be mutually operative. And if the agent intellect operates, the passive intellect also operates. Thus, the agent intellect is never going to abstract a universal idea without impressing that idea upon the passive intellect, and thus the person knowing when he's knowing. You see what I'm saying? He's affirming the unity of the two powers here, and that both are always needed for every act of knowledge. All right, finally, any questions to this point?
When it comes to his comment in the itinerarium of
You got a bad echo.
I heard you laugh 18 times just now.
what does he say in the itinerarium? The apprehension, delight, and judgment. Are we still at apprehension right now?
That's right. We're still at apprehension.
Okay.
Yep. Because this is the apprehension is simply the term of abstraction.
Okay.
It is the basis of knowledge.
Because that's
So
what
apprehension means. Go ahead.
that putting delight after apprehension sort of confused me, because it seemed like, I mean, maybe delight, he's saying more of a spiritual delight than like the concupiscible appetite.
Yeah, I think so. I think that sounds correct. It also could be in that context where, and I would have to look more closely at the broader context. It could be delight used metaphorically as achieving some sort of harmony or proportion, some sort of adequation that is fitting between the mind and the thing itself too. But I'm not sure. I'd have to look. But you're right. That's good to point out. We're still at the moment of apprehension, and really, most of the discussion of divine illumination in chapter 4 of the De Scientia Christi is at the level of apprehension. Okay.
Okay.
So moving on to question 4. Now we've said, and I trust you guys have read this fairly carefully. We've already said that Bonaventure accepts the fact of knowledge. He's not accepted. And this, save for some qualifications with respect to the activity of the soul with respect to material objects and the activity of the passive intellect itself, the account is basically Aristotelian. It's basically Aristotelian abstraction. While affirming with St. Thomas the distinctness of each agent intellect in each knowing person. Okay? What Bonaventure then does is he asks, not that it is possible, but how it's possible. And here, he's affirming with Plato the notion of the eternal truths, but he's affirming with Augustine two notions, that these eternal truths are in the mind of God, and as being in the mind of God, they're really identical with God because, well, God is simple and infinite. And he's also affirming with St. Augustine the reality of some need for divine illumination in order to explain or give an account of the fact of knowledge, the fact of abstraction, and how abstraction can actually terminate in something spiritual. And what Bonaventure does beyond Augustine here is he tries to provide a theory of divine illumination and not just present a doctrine of divine illumination. And I hate to admit this, but I'm not sure we'll get through this today. Okay. What does divine illumination purport to supply in the process of human knowledge? It ultimately purports to supply or underwrite or explain how knowledge can arrive from sensible, mutable material substances operated upon by a changeable, mutable soul or intellect. How does this matter arrive at some sort of spiritual, eternal, and immutable necessary truth? So in this part, Bonaventure is not really explaining anymore the how knowledge arises. He's explaining now, well, how knowledge is possible as a fact, granting that fact. And so in this sense, Bonaventure then speaks of divine illumination. Now, in his account of what divine illumination is, Bonaventure begins by specifying what it is not. Divine illumination is not the operation of God's causality in the soul, causing the soul both to be, but especially to operate as an intellectual power. Divine illumination is not God's activity in the soul as the sole or exclusive and complete cause of knowledge. What Bonaventure here is denying is that God just simply zaps the soul with abstract ideas, and he infuses them from above, and that sensory information is, either false or totally unnecessary. He says this is the wrong explanation because A, it would deny any usefulness of the natural faculties of the senses, and it would go against the common sense, in a sense, history of how we had come to know through sense experience. And it would also render, in a certain sense, the soul always in a state of knowing with absolute clarity, complete knowledge. The second, or another thing that he wants to rule out, another way of understanding divine illumination, is the soul, through divine illumination, arrives at a state of knowing that is identical with the state of being in a state of grace. So, Bonaventure wants to say then that divine illumination is not God just simply evacuating or making redundant the natural sensory powers, nor does he want divine illumination to function as simply the same as being in a state of grace. So he wants to affirm natural causality and abstraction with Aristotle, and he also wants to affirm that divine illumination isn't sanctifying grace. Okay. Let me look here. The three problems he notes is if it's this first sort of knowledge, well then there really simply isn't any abstraction. If God is the total and sole cause of divine illumination, is the total and sole cause of knowledge, well then there is no reality of abstraction. Abstraction just simply doesn't occur. A second problem arises that if you affirm that in divine illumination God functions as the total and sole cause of knowledge, well then there would be no difference, according to Bonaventure, between earthly knowledge and heavenly knowledge. Basically, everyone would equally have the same kind of knowledge, and it would always be unqualifiedly divine. And then a third problem that arises is that you would have a very difficult time distinguishing between science and wisdom, because there would be no distinction then between reason and faith as motivated by charity, a trusting of God on his authority, and the operation of the Holy Spirit. So then there would be a difficult time distinguishing between knowledge and wisdom. Okay? So these are three problems that Bonaventure sees in asserting that divine illumination is the total and sole cause. This is important because Bonaventure here is already preempting the kind of argumentation or the kind of account of divine illumination that Henry of Ghent will give about 25, 30 years later. Where Henry of Ghent, and this is the understanding of divine illumination that Scotus will criticize. Henry of Ghent says basically the rational powers, namely the senses and the intellect as abstractive, are simply unreliable, and the only mechanism for arriving reliably at truth is through God's divine illumination, where God's activity of illumining is the sufficient reason for certainty and knowledge. Well, Scotus just simply says this completely renders the rational faculties absurd and redundant. Moreover, he asks, is it really plausible to provide a rational explanation for certainty on the basis of divine illumination, and yet still have that illumination be the source of that rationality? So he says basically if there is no rationality or rational powers as such, it becomes very difficult to distinguish between what's true illumination or the grounds of illumination itself and deception and falsehood. And so Bonaventure doesn't fall prey to this because he already says divine illumination is not the sole or total cause of knowledge. Rather, illumination is what he calls the motive and regulative cause of knowledge. And we'll get to that in shortly. So then, Bonaventure here, and this is where we get to his discussion with St. Thomas. He rejects a couple of opinions. He rejects the notion that divine illumination is merely a kind of influence, an external aid to the mind, yet the mind doesn't attain to eternal reasons themselves, but rather attains to abstract ideas. Now, this mere influence notion that's external is essentially what St. Thomas would hold, is that yes, God does, through a kind of concursus, operate with the soul, but with the soul in a manner that's no different than God operates with sub-rational creatures. And so there's no need, according to St. Thomas, for divine illumination as something that is direct and always operating in the mind's act of arriving at certain knowledge, in a sense from within, because Bonaventure says St. Thomas himself says that abstraction alone is sufficient to provide the grounds for certainty. Now, Bonaventure's response, as you'll see in the conclusion, is that this notion is certainly contrary to Augustine, who affirms divine illumination. Two, and this is where he's getting into his own reasoning, a mere influence theory that just says, yeah, we arrive at necessary immutable truths through abstraction alone from material substances. He says this is insufficient because the abstracted product or the abstracted idea would still be a product of our own mind. And so a power that's mutable, stemming from or flowing out of a soul or an intellect that's mutable, is insufficient to produce an immutable necessary concept. This is where Bonaventure is just simply using Aristotelian axioms here. The effect cannot exceed its cause. So if the soul is mutable and changeable, and the objects of the soul's knowledge are material, well then how do you arrive again at certain immutable, spiritual, eternal truths? And then finally, this notion of influence doesn't yet address what kind of influence this would be. Would it be, Bonaventure asks, well, would it be a general influence, kind of like, God influencing squirrels to produce squirrels, or influencing through the mediation of the sun, flowers to grow through photosynthesis? Would it be this kind of influence? Would it be a general concursus? Or would it be another kind of influence, namely a special concursus, which Bonaventure calls the influence of grace? Well, Bonaventure rejects both of these options because the general concursus isn't yet specific to the dignity of a rational creature as mediating and participating in spiritual realities, yet not per se participating in a manner that is grace-filled. And this leads us to the rejection of the second point, is it can't be that kind of influence that we call grace, or the grace of the Spirit, because then in any act of knowing, that act of knowing itself would be an act that was produced through sanctifying grace. So Bonaventure says, no, both of those extremes don't explain it. And he says, well, I'll choose a middle position, or a third way, a via media. And he wasn't an Anglican. So he says this third way posits, one, that the eternal reason, or eternal reasons, these eternal ideas, function as the regulating and motivating principles of knowledge. Namely, these ideas that we arrive at through abstraction. But these eternal ideas as regulating and motivating are not the sole principle, nor are they fully clear, especially in our fallen state. And then finally, these sole reasons, these eternal reasons, as regulating and motivating, function along with the operation of created reason, namely abstraction, to provide what Bonaventure calls these contuited ideas, or these ideas are contuited in and through and with abstraction. And contuition just simply means seeing with, a seeing with. So the Bonaventure wants to say then, through contuition, the abstracted notion, the soul in abstracting, say, the idea of a cat, contuits with the cat as regulating this abstracted idea of catness, the eternal idea or ratio of catness. And it's through attaining to the eternal idea or ratio of catness that the abstract concept, originating in the material substance of a cat and moving through the process of abstraction through the operation of the agent intellect, which is mutable, this is what allows for the idea of a cat to be rendered certain. So the act of apprehension, then, there can be a quasi-judgment, or deudicatio, Bonaventure says, about the abstracted concept of cat, the concept of cat, because in abstraction, the eternal ideas are contuited along with abstraction. And why the eternal ideas are necessary, we've already explained, because science itself is given as knowledge of necessary truths. This is Aristotle. And necessary means immutable, and necessary and immutable have something to do with eternal. Okay? But the fact is we don't begin, our knowledge doesn't begin in eternity. It begins in material and moves through temporal change, even in a spiritual operation, such as the operation of the intellect. And so, granting that knowledge exists, well, how do we explain knowledge? Bonaventure says it's through attaining directly to the eternal reason through this notion of contuition, that we can have certainty or make a certain judgment that our abstract concept actually is true and necessary and immutable. And then now going back to God's knowledge. Remember we said that God has an infinite number of ideas. So thus he must have the idea, for example, of a cat. He must also have an idea of the extension of catness in every instance of a possible cat, an actual cat, a future cat, but no final cat. because there are no cats in heaven, right? Even if there are dogs, I suppose. So what actually functions here is this is quite interesting because Bonaventure here is operating on a kind of quasi-mathematical basis, which seems a lot like an application or an instance of set theory. God possesses the set of all ideas, and within that set is included every particular kind, and within that set is included every particular possible, actual, or future instance of that kind. So thus God's actual knowledge in his exemplary idea of catness contains via this distinctio differentia minima every possible and actual cat. And thus, if our abstracted idea of a cat, which is certainly not as exhaustive, it's not infinite, right? But if our idea conforms to that eternal exemplar, and we come to it, and we can, in a sense, make this kind of comparison between this eternal idea and our abstracted idea through this contuition, it's not a conscious process. Bonaventure here is giving a metaphysical account of what happens psychologically in virtue of or conditioned by the metaphysical grounds needed for explaining the psychological process in terms of its term, which is universal knowledge, that seems to exceed the psychological process. So what Bonaventure is doing here is because God's knowledge extends to everything knowable about cat, when we contuit that idea, and we find that our abstracted idea of catness corresponds to this eternal reason of catness, well then suddenly our idea of catness is ratified and validated in virtue of God's infinite knowledge. And so it's this kind of relationship then that Bonaventure is explaining as the ground or condition of certain knowledge, certain judgment about our concepts as true and eternal. And what we need to do is actually stop. It's a little bit after 5, and then next week. Wait, actually, I should ask: are there any questions at this point?
2 questions. The first one has 2 parts.
You know what? You should ask 3 questions because this is a class on Bonaventure. So, but the first one has 2 parts.
So 3 questions.
So no, there are 3 questions.
The first one, regulating, what does he mean? The second one, motivating, what does he mean? And then the third one, will maybe become apparent again later. Oh, yeah, so the third one, eternal reasons. God knows all possible things, including all existing particulars. And is it that aspect of to where I, in a sense, I attain, or I could, possibly attain not only to humanity, but also to Jared-aity, or,
what the heck are you talking about?
But is that then where intuitive cognition would come in for SCOTUS of the particular?
Yes, but for SCOTUS, intuitive cognition is just the knowledge of something existing and present, but it's not quitative. It doesn't specify or doesn't pertain to the formal content or nature of what is being known.
So it doesn't have the fullest, but I've heard, at least when Father Peter says that that's sort of, that his intuitive cognition refers somewhat to divine illumination, to be that where we're attaining or not attaining, or maybe just very, very, very distantly attaining to a eternal reason of the particular.
Okay, now I can't answer the second question this week, but I'm writing it down. Because really what we have to distinguish here is divine illumination as a condition of a rational agent's intellectual operation, and divine illumination in terms of a punctuated or individual act of knowing.
Wow.
So in the former sense, as the mode, it does correspond closely to intuitive cognition of being, right? Through intuitively cognizing the existence and presence of a particular being. And so divine illumination, in terms of the mode of the operation and existence of a rational creature, is like that. But in terms of the operation or act of the intellect knowing and attaining via divine illumination to the eternal reason, it's not exactly addressing the same question, although the second is a condition of the former. The latter is a condition of the former. The act of attaining to the eternal reason and making a certain judgment through divine illumination is conditioned upon the mode of the soul being essentially divinely illuminated. Does that make sense? Are you following those two distinctions?
I think I sort of get what your point is, but then particularly then going back to the first two.
Regulating and motivating?
Yeah, like
Okay.
regulating makes a bit more sense, like it sort of guides or something, but
Yes.
motivating, I'm thinking something like a motivational speaker or something.
Well, okay. The regulating, obviously, this is with respect to the abstracted idea in comparison or attained with the eternal idea. Now, we've already talked about God's knowledge, how it's perfect, and how if we attain to contuitively the eternal idea, this eternal idea will regulate the content, but specifically the truth value, the certainty of the abstracted idea. So that's how it regulates. It functions as a rule.
Okay.
The eternal idea is that by which we make judgments, even with respect to our own knowledge of catness and of this cat. Okay, so that's regulating. That serves as a rule. Now, motivating is a little bit less clear, but in the first sense, it would be motivating in terms of the fact that this eternal idea is the very ground upon which the cat exists in itself, is the ground upon which the soul and its operations exists and acts out. It's the ground or condition for the validity of the abstractive process of abstracting a concept. So that's one way it can be motivating. It serves as a primordial motivation or condition which kicks into motion all these other things that exist. But a second aspect has to do with the fact that as motivating, thinking back now to our discussion of the unity of the soul and its powers, and the orientation, the inherent orientation of intellection to some volitional stance and activity, well, divine illumination also has a motivating factor that speaks of the need for, when the intellect makes a judgment about the truth of something, it also makes a judgment, at least implicitly, that the intellect is not the source of truth, but rather, through a reductive process, God is the source of truth, right? And this insight, this deudicatio, about God being the source of truth and myself not being the source of truth, motivates the will because it presents this truth to the will in order to take a posture or response to this truth. So there's a motivating, yes, a motivational speaker, that's right, it's the internal word, Christ, who teaches every man, who motivates through the very operation of truth itself, the intellect or the will to take an effective stance or posture towards that truth. And so this would then be on both the philosophical level and the theological and mystical levels, the disposition of knowledge to love, of intellection to volition. Because when we know finite being, we have an implicit knowledge, and if we follow the implications of that knowledge, we have an explicit knowledge of infinite being, who's the source of all being, truth, and goodness. And the knowledge of this is presented to our will, whose object is what? The good, and has the power to spontaneously take a posture or a stance towards that good that is known through the intellect. So in that sense, the regulative and motivating aspects of this have a great deal to do with what Bonaventure will say in questions 3 through 5 about wisdom, Christ's wisdom, created wisdom and uncreated wisdom. And so, yeah, we can give a quick survey, but I guarantee, so next week, we're going to move on to the disputed questions of the mystery of the Trinity after we wrap up question 4. And if you think of questions about question 4, write them down and we'll get to them at the beginning, because I only want to spend about 20 minutes on the disputed question number 4 and then wrap up the disputed questions on the knowledge of Christ before we move into the mystery of the Trinity. And the mystery of the Trinity, we'll get to look more. We're not going to read the whole text because we're a little bit behind, but we're going to look at Bonaventure's understanding or arguments for the existence of God. He presents 29 of them in the first question. And then we'll look at his account of simplicity, infinity, and especially necessity, because necessity speaks to his understanding of the will. So, well, that's in question 7. So I'll assign sections of that text to look at next week.
I uploaded in week 8. There's a PDF of it uploaded.
Oh, great. Okay. Thank you very much. That's very helpful. And so we'll go through that next week. We'll begin that. And so are there any questions at this point?
I would just like it, the sooner you just tell us what to focus on so we're reading the right parts, that would be much appreciated.
Oh, yes, I will do that. I'll get that to you tonight or tomorrow morning.
Thank you.
Any other observations, questions?
Just wanted to say thank you. Appreciate it. Got a jet.
All right. Good night. Thank you.
Bye all.
Dr. Pedro.
See you later.
Well, good. Well, thank you for your kind attention. I know this stuff is somewhat heavy going, and hopefully it's becoming a bit clearer through this process. But please continue to ask questions, write down questions, ask for points of clarification, that sort of thing.
Very good.
Thank you, Dr. Goff.
Thank you.
Dr. Goff, you said last week that when the Cubs won that you had 2 predictions that Trump was going to win and that a Dominican Pope was going to make Duns Scotus a saint. You're halfway there.
Well, you better start praying a lot about the second. I don't know. I don't know what's less possible. The Cubs winning the World Series or a Dominican canonizing Duns Scotus. I don't know. We'll have to see.
One thing that struck me about Trump, I was telling Augustine, is that he really spent no more than he had to, and he did no more than he had to just barely win.
That's right. That's right. It was interesting watching the returns on Tuesday. I don't know if you guys watched any of those, but when it became apparent towards the beginning, he'd already had something like 140 electoral votes had been called, and an overwhelming number of additional electoral votes he was in the lead of. But you had these websites still predicting like an 85% chance that Hillary would win. I mean, it was amazing. I think, to clarify though, I think I predicted that Hillary. Well, it is recorded, so we can go back to the record. I think I predicted that Hillary would not win, but I don't think I predicted Trump would win.
Okay.
But I wasn't so specific. I didn't have the contuition of the eternal idea on that one.
Yeah.
Well, can we close in a quick word of prayer?
In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. We give you thanks, Almighty God, for these and all thy blessings, you who live and reign forever and ever.
Amen.
Thank you, the spouse of the Holy Spirit.
Pray for us.
Blessed John Duns Scotus and Saint Bonaventure.
Pray for us.
Through the intercession of the Blessed Virgin Mary and Saint Joseph, and Almighty God bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you again.
God bless. Have a good weekend.
Ave Maria.
Thank you.